Hey there, and welcome to After Dark Horrors. I'm here to help you unwind tonight. Before you get too comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe. Only if you really enjoy what I'm doing here. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It's always cool to see how connected we all are. I think you'll enjoy these stories. Honestly, there's something you won't find anywhere else. So, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that background hum, and let's get started. Sometimes the most ordinary people discover the most extraordinary evil. And once you've seen it, there's no going back to the world you thought you knew. True dark cult stories that will shock you. Story 1. The Welcome Committee I Never Believed in Cults Until I Moved to Cedar Falls, Montana in the spring of 2019. My name is David, and I was a 28-year-old software developer looking for a fresh start after a messy divorce. The job market in tech was good, even in smaller cities, and I'd landed a remote position that let me live anywhere with decent internet. Cedar Falls seemed perfect, quiet, affordable, surrounded by mountains, and far enough from civilization that I could heal from everything that had gone wrong in my previous life. The town had about 8,000 residents, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the biggest excitement is the annual Harvest Festival, and where newcomers are either welcomed with open arms or viewed with suspicion. I was hoping for the former, but prepared for the latter. My first indication that something was different about Cedar Falls came during my second week there. I was grocery shopping at the only supermarket in town, a place called Morrison's that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. The floors creaked, the fluorescent lights hummed with an electrical buzz that made my teeth ache, and half the shelves seemed perpetually understocked. I was in the cereal aisle, trying to decide between generic cornflakes and name brand when an elderly woman approached me. She was probably in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and the kind of floral dress that suggested she'd gotten dressed up for grocery shopping. "You must be David," she said, and her voice had a warmth to it that immediately put me at ease. "I'm Margaret Thompson. Welcome to Cedar Falls." I was surprised she knew my name, but small towns work that way. Word travels fast, and a new resident is big news. "Thank you," I said. "It's a beautiful place. I'm looking forward to getting settled." Margaret smiled, but there was something in her eyes that I couldn't quite read. "I'm sure you'll fit right in once you understand how things work around here. We're very community-oriented. Everyone contributes. Everyone belongs." The way she emphasized everyone struck me as odd, but I chalked it up to small-town friendliness, taken to its logical extreme. We chatted for a few more minutes about the weather, the local hiking trails, and the best place to get coffee in town. Margaret was pleasant, knowledgeable, and seemed genuinely interested in helping me adjust to my new home. As we were wrapping up our conversation, Margaret pulled a small card from her purse and handed it to me. It was cream-colored, with elegant script printing that read, "Cedar Falls Community Enhancement Society, building tomorrow through unity today." Below that was an address and a phone number. "We meet every Thursday evening at 7, Margaret said. "It's a great way to get involved, meet your neighbors, learn about local projects. I think you'd really enjoy it." I thanked her and pocketed the card, though I had no real intention of attending. I'd moved to Cedar Falls specifically to avoid getting tangled up in community obligations and social expectations. I wanted quiet, solitude, and the freedom to rebuild my life without well-meaning neighbors trying to integrate me into their social circles. But over the next few days, I found myself thinking about Margaret's invitation. Other residents I met mentioned the Community Enhancement Society in passing, the mailman, the woman who ran the hardware store, even the teenager who delivered my internet installation. Everyone seemed to know about it, and everyone spoke of it with the kind of reverence usually reserved for churches or important civic institutions. My curiosity got the better of me. That Thursday evening, I drove to the address on Margaret's card, which turned out to be a community center on the edge of town. The building was nothing special, single-story brick construction from the 1960s, with a parking lot that needed repaving and landscaping that had seen better days. About 30 cars were parked outside, which seemed like a good turnout for a town the size of Cedar Falls. I sat in my car for a few minutes, second-guessing my decision to come. The rational part of my mind knew this was probably just a bunch of well-meaning citizens discussing potholes and park maintenance. But something about the whole situation felt off in a way I couldn't articulate. I was about to drive home when Margaret emerged from the building and waved at me. She must have been watching for my arrival, which seemed both thoughtful and slightly unsettling. I had no choice but to get out of my car and follow her inside. The community center's interior was exactly what I'd expected. Linoleum floors, acoustic tile ceilings, folding chairs arranged in neat rows facing a small stage. About 60 people were seated and chatting quietly among themselves. The crowd was diverse in age but uniformly white, which wasn't surprising given the demographics of rural Montana. What was surprising was how they all turned to look at me when I entered. Not the casual glances you might expect when a newcomer arrives at a community meeting, but focused, sustained attention that made my skin prickle with discomfort. The conversations didn't stop, but the volume dropped noticeably, and I could feel dozens of eyes tracking my movement as Margaret led me to an empty chair in the third row. "Everyone's excited to meet you," Margaret whispered as we sat down. "We don't get many new residents." The meeting began promptly at 7 o'clock when a man in his 50s took the stage. He was tall and thin, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of commanding presence that suggested he was accustomed to being listened to. He wore a simple white button-down shirt and dark slacks, and when he spoke, his voice carried easily through the room without the need for a microphone. "Good evening, friends," he said. "For our visitor, I'm Pastor William Chen. I founded the Community Enhancement Society 12 years ago to help Cedar Falls reach its full potential." Pastor Chen's eyes found mine in the crowd, and he smiled with what seemed like genuine warmth. "David, welcome. We're honored to have you join us tonight." The fact that he knew my name shouldn't have surprised me. Margaret had obviously told him I was coming, but something about the way he said it with a kind of intimate familiarity made me uncomfortable. Pastor Chen began his presentation, which focused on various community improvement projects the Society had completed over the years. They'd renovated the town library, organized volunteer crews to maintain public spaces, established a food bank for struggling families, and coordinated disaster relief efforts during a particularly harsh winter 2 years earlier. All of this sounded admirable and exactly what I'd expect from a civic organization. But as Pastor Chen talked, I began to notice subtle things that didn't quite fit. The audience's attention was absolute. Nobody checked their phones, shifted in their seats, or showed the usual signs of polite boredom that characterize most community meetings. When Pastor Chen made points, people nodded in perfect synchronization. When he paused for emphasis, the silence was complete and immediate. More unsettling was the language Pastor Chen used. He talked about unified purpose, collective commitment, and transcending individual limitations for the greater good. These phrases could have been innocuous in another context, but something about his delivery, the slight emphasis on certain words, the way his eyes swept the crowd as he spoke, gave them an almost hypnotic quality. About 20 minutes into the presentation, Pastor Chen shifted topics from past achievements to future goals. "We stand at a crossroads," he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "Cedar Falls has the potential to become something truly special, a model for communities across the nation. But this will require sacrifice from all of us. It will require us to put the needs of the collective above our individual desires." The audience murmured agreement, and I found myself nodding along despite my growing unease. There was something compelling about Pastor Chen's vision, a sense that he was offering something larger and more meaningful than the ordinary concerns of daily life. Some of you have already made the commitment to full participation, Pastor Chen continued. You've opened your hearts and homes to the Society's mission. You've demonstrated your willingness to serve something greater than yourselves. As he spoke, about a dozen people in the audience stood up. They were scattered throughout the room, but they moved with the same precise timing that had characterized the earlier nodding. Once standing, they began to walk toward the stage, where Pastor Chen waited with arms outstretched as if blessing them. The people who stood were of various ages and backgrounds, but they all had a similar expression, serene, almost beatific, as if they'd found something the rest of us were still searching for. When they reached the stage, they arranged themselves in a semicircle behind Pastor Chen, facing the audience. These individuals have chosen to join our inner circle, Pastor Chen explained. They've committed to living according to our principles, not just during our Thursday meetings, but every day in every aspect of their lives. They've found peace through surrender, purpose through service, fulfillment through unity. One of the people on stage, a woman probably in her 40s, stepped forward. I recognized her as the librarian I'd met earlier that week when I'd gone to get a library card. She'd seemed normal then, friendly but reserved, professional in her interactions. Now she looked different. Her eyes had a glassy quality, and when she spoke, her voice had a monotone quality that sounded rehearsed. Before I joined the inner circle, I was lost, she said. I thought I was happy, but I was really just existing, going through the motions of a meaningless life. The Society showed me that true happiness comes from giving up the illusion of individual will and embracing our collective destiny. Other members of the inner circle shared similar testimonials. They talked about surrendering their personal desires, finding peace through obedience, and discovering their true purpose through service to the Society. Each story followed the same pattern: previous unhappiness, revelation through the Society, current bliss through surrender. As I listened, my unease deepened into genuine alarm. These people weren't just enthusiastic community volunteers. They were describing something that sounded dangerously like what I'd read about in cult testimonials. The language of surrendering individual will, finding purpose through obedience, and achieving happiness by giving up personal desires were classic warning signs. I glanced around the room to see how other audience members were reacting to these testimonials. What I saw chilled me. Everyone was listening with rapt attention. Many were crying, and several were reaching toward the stage as if desperate to touch the speakers. This wasn't normal community enthusiasm. This was worship. Pastor Chen raised his hands, and the testimonials stopped immediately. The inner circle represents the future of Cedar Falls, he said. But we need more. We need every resident to understand their role in our collective destiny. Tonight, I'm extending an invitation to 3 more members of our community to join us in full commitment. Pastor Chen's eyes swept the audience, and I had the terrible feeling he was looking directly at me. David, he said, and my blood turned cold, you came to Cedar Falls seeking a new beginning. We can offer you something better, a new identity, a new purpose, a new family that will never abandon you. Every head in the room turned toward me. 60 pairs of eyes stared with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. I could hear my own heartbeat amplified in the sudden quiet of the room. I appreciate the offer, I stammered, but I'm still settling in. Maybe in a few months. Pastor Chen's smile never wavered, but something shifted in his eyes. Of course, major life changes take time to process. But David, I hope you'll consider what we're offering carefully. Cedar Falls takes care of its own, but only if they're truly committed to being part of our community. The way he emphasized truly committed sent a chill down my spine. It sounded less like an invitation and more like a threat. The meeting concluded with what Pastor Chen called a unity exercise. The entire audience stood and joined hands, forming a human chain that connected every person in the room. Pastor Chen led them in a chant that I couldn't quite make out. The words seemed to shift and blur as they were repeated, taking on an almost hypnotic rhythm. I found myself holding hands with Margaret on one side and a man I didn't recognize on the other. The warmth of human contact should have been comforting, but instead it felt invasive, as if something was trying to flow from their hands into mine. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, and I began to feel lightheaded. Just as I thought I might pass out, the chant ended abruptly. People began to file out of the community center, chatting normally as if nothing unusual had happened. Margaret walked me to my car, maintaining pleasant small talk about the upcoming weather and recommending a local restaurant I should try. "I hope you found tonight enlightening," she said as I unlocked my car door. "Pastor Chen has such wisdom to share. I think you'll find that the more you participate, the more you'll discover about yourself." I thanked her and drove home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed during that meeting. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed that the streetlight near my house was out, casting my neighborhood in unusual darkness. I told myself it was probably just a burned-out bulb, but I couldn't help feeling like the shadows were deeper than they should be. Over the next few days, I tried to process what I'd experienced at the Community Enhancement Society meeting. I researched cults online, reading about recruitment techniques, indoctrination processes, and the psychological mechanisms that lead people to surrender their autonomy to charismatic leaders. Everything I read seemed to match what I'd observed. The testimonials about finding happiness through surrender, the emphasis on collective identity over individual will, the way Pastor Chen commanded absolute attention from his audience. These were textbook cult behaviors. But I was also aware that I might be overreacting. Small communities often have strong social bonds and shared values that can seem strange to outsiders. I decided to do some more research about Cedar Falls itself. What I found online was mostly routine: town website with information about local government, a few tourist pages highlighting hiking trails and scenic views, some real estate listings. But there were also some things that struck me as odd. The town's official history went back to 1887, when it was founded as a logging community. But according to the records I could find, there had been a significant population decline in the early 2000s as the logging industry died out and young people moved to larger cities for employment opportunities. By 2005, the population had dropped to around 3,000 residents, but current census data showed the population had rebounded to over 8,000. That was unusual for a rural town, without any obvious economic drivers. I couldn't find any major employers that had moved to Cedar Falls, no industrial development, no tourism boom that would explain why people would choose to relocate there. I also noticed that online reviews and social media posts about Cedar Falls were strangely uniform. People described it as peaceful, welcoming, and a place where you can find your true purpose. The language was almost identical across multiple platforms and reviewers, as if people were working from the same script. Most disturbing were the missing persons reports I found buried in local news archives. Over the past 10 years, at least 15 people who had visited Cedar Falls or moved there temporarily had simply vanished. The cases had received minimal media coverage, and in each instance, the official explanation was that the person had chosen to leave town without notifying anyone. But the pattern was troubling. These weren't typical missing persons cases involving people with histories of mental illness or substance abuse. They were tourists, temporary workers, people who had come to Cedar Falls for short visits and then disappeared completely. Their cars were found abandoned, their personal belongings left behind, and despite extensive searches, no traces of them were ever discovered. I was beginning to think I'd made a serious mistake in moving to Cedar Falls. But I'd signed a year lease on my house. My job was going well, and I didn't have the financial resources to pack up and leave immediately. I decided to be more cautious to avoid further involvement with the Community Enhancement Society while I figured out my next steps. That plan lasted exactly 3 days. On Sunday morning, I woke up to find my front yard filled with flowers. Not planted flowers, cut flowers arranged in elaborate patterns across my entire lawn. There were hundreds of them, roses, lilies, daisies, and dozens of varieties I couldn't identify. They formed concentric circles around my house, with paths leading from my front door to the street and from my back door to the garden. The flowers were beautiful, but there was something deeply unsettling about finding them there. Someone had spent hours arranging this display, and they'd done it silently, in the dark, without waking me or triggering the motion sensor lights I'd installed around my property. I called the police, but the response wasn't what I'd expected. Officer Patricia Reeves arrived about 30 minutes after my call. She was a woman in her 40s with short-cropped brown hair and the kind of professional demeanor I associated with competent law enforcement. But when she saw the flower display, her reaction was strange. "How beautiful," she said, walking slowly through the patterns. "Someone spent a lot of time on this. You should feel honored." "Honored?" I said. "Someone trespassed on my property in the middle of the night and left hundreds of flowers. This isn't normal behavior." Officer Reeves looked at me with what seemed like genuine confusion. "David, this is clearly a welcome gift from your neighbors. In a small community like Cedar Falls, this is how people show they care about you. By sneaking onto my property at night, by going to extraordinary effort to make you feel welcome. I think you're overreacting to a beautiful gesture." Officer Reeves refused to file a report or investigate further. She suggested I thank whoever had created the flower display and advised me to embrace the community spirit that makes Cedar Falls special. After she left, I spent the morning photographing the flower arrangements and then cleaning them up. It took me 4 hours to gather all the flowers and dispose of them. As I worked, several neighbors walked by, and each one commented on how beautiful the display had been and how lucky I was to have received such a wonderful welcome gift. Their reactions convinced me that this wasn't a random act of vandalism or harassment. This was a message from the Community Enhancement Society, a demonstration of their reach and influence in the town. They could access my property whenever they wanted, and the local authorities wouldn't help me. I decided to be more proactive in my research. That evening, I drove to the community center and parked across the street, hoping to observe another society meeting without participating. I brought binoculars and a camera, planning to document whatever I could see. The meeting started at 7 o'clock, just as it had the previous Thursday. I watched through my binoculars as people filed into the building, recognizing many faces from my first meeting. But there were also people I hadn't seen before, and several of them were clearly not from Cedar Falls. 3 people arrived in a van with Oregon license plates. They looked like tourists, casual clothes, cameras around their necks, the slightly lost expression of people visiting an unfamiliar place. A middle-aged couple arrived in a rental car, checking GPS coordinates on their phone. A young woman with a backpack and hiking boots walked to the community center from the direction of the town's only motel. These people were clearly visitors, not residents, but they entered the community center with the same purposeful stride as everyone else, as if they knew exactly why they were there. I waited until the meeting had been going for about 30 minutes, then crept closer to the building. There were windows along the side wall, but they were set too high for me to see through from ground level. I found an old wooden crate behind the building and used it to boost myself up to one of the windows. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. The visitors I'd observed entering the building were now on the stage with Pastor Chen, but they weren't standing there voluntarily. Their hands were bound behind their backs with what looked like zip ties, and their mouths were covered with duct tape. Their eyes were wide with terror, and they were struggling against their restraints. Pastor Chen was addressing the audience, but I couldn't make out his words through the glass. The regular society members were watching intently, showing no signs of concern or alarm at the obvious distress of the people on stage. Some were taking notes. Others were recording the proceedings with their phones. As I watched, several members of the inner circle approached the bound visitors. They carried what looked like syringes, and despite the victims' struggles, they managed to inject each person with some kind of drug. Within minutes, the visitors stopped struggling. Their eyes became glassy and unfocused, and their body language shifted from terrified resistance to passive compliance. I was witnessing a kidnapping and drugging in progress, and I was the only person who seemed to recognize it as a crime. I fumbled for my phone to call 911, but before I could dial, I heard footsteps behind me. "David," a familiar voice said. I really wish you hadn't seen that. I turned to find Pastor Chen standing behind me, flanked by two large men I recognized as society members. Chen was smiling, but his eyes were cold and predatory. Curiosity is a wonderful trait, but it can also be dangerous, especially in someone who hasn't committed to being part of our community. I jumped down from the crate and tried to run, but the two men were faster and stronger than me. They grabbed my arms and dragged me toward the back door of the community center. I tried to scream for help, but one of them clamped a hand over my mouth. "Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be," Pastor Chen said, as they forced me inside. "You're going to join us eventually. The only question is whether you do it willingly or whether we help you make the decision." They brought me into the main meeting room, where the audience was still seated as if nothing unusual had happened. The bound visitors were no longer on the stage, but I could see a door marked "Private" that hadn't been there during my previous visit. Muffled sounds came from behind that door, voices, movement, what might have been crying. Pastor Chen took the stage and addressed the audience. "Friends, David has decided to join us tonight after all. He's been struggling with commitment, but I believe he's ready to take the next step in his journey toward enlightenment." The audience applauded enthusiastically. Several people called out encouragement. "Welcome, David. You're making the right choice. We're here to help you." I tried to speak, to tell them I was being held against my will, but the man holding me tightened his grip and whispered, "Stay quiet, and this will be easier for everyone." Pastor Chen continued his address. "David represents a common challenge in our work, the individual who recognizes the value of community but struggles to surrender the illusion of personal autonomy. Tonight, we'll help him understand that true freedom comes through submission to collective will." He gestured toward the private door, and it opened. The three visitors I'd seen bound and drugged were led out by society members, but they looked completely different now. Their restraints were gone, and they were smiling serenely. They moved with the same glassy-eyed compliance I'd noticed in the inner circle members. "Behold," Pastor Chen said, "the power of unity." These individuals came to Cedar Falls as lost souls, seeking meaning in their empty lives. We've given them purpose, community, and the peace that comes from knowing their place in the greater design. One of the former visitors, the young woman with the backpack, stepped forward. "I feel so grateful," she said in a monotone voice that was completely different from any natural speech pattern. "I was wandering aimlessly, but now I understand my role. I will serve the society and help others find the same peace I've discovered." The audience responded with more applause and verbal encouragement. To them, this was obviously a beautiful spiritual transformation. To me, it looked like brainwashing, or worse. Pastor Chen turned his attention back to me. "David, you have two choices. You can join our inner circle willingly, embracing the peace and purpose we offer, or we can help you overcome your resistance through the same process our new friends have experienced." He gestured toward the private door again. "Behind that door is a space where we help people process their attachment to individual will. It's not painful, but it is intensive. Most people find the willing path much more comfortable." I looked around the room at the 60 society members watching me with expectant faces. These were people I'd met around town: the mailman, the hardware store clerk, the librarian, ordinary residents of what I'd thought was an ordinary small town. But now I could see what I'd missed before. The slight glassy quality in their eyes, the too perfect synchronization of their movements, the way they all seemed to share the same thoughts and reactions. They weren't ordinary residents. They were all members of Pastor Chen's cult, all people who had surrendered their individual will to his collective vision, and now they wanted me to join them. "I need time to think," I said, hoping to buy myself a few minutes to figure out an escape plan. Pastor Chen shook his head. "I'm afraid that's not possible, David. You've seen too much tonight to leave without making a commitment. We can't risk having someone in our community who might undermine the harmony we've worked so hard to create." He nodded to the men holding me, and they began dragging me toward the private door. I struggled as hard as I could, but they were too strong, and no one in the audience showed any concern for my obvious distress. Just as we reached the door, the fire alarm went off. The piercing sound filled the community center, and emergency lights began flashing. In the confusion that followed, the men holding me loosened their grip slightly, and I managed to break free. I ran toward the main exit, pushing through the crowd of society members who were milling around in confusion. Some tried to grab me, but the alarm and flashing lights had disrupted their usual eerie coordination. I made it to the door and sprinted to my car, expecting to hear footsteps behind me at any moment, but no one followed. As I drove away, I could see society members filing out of the community center in orderly lines, showing no signs of panic or urgency despite the fire alarm. They seemed to be treating the whole thing as a minor inconvenience rather than an emergency. I drove straight home, threw my essential belongings into a suitcase, and loaded my car. I was on the highway heading south within an hour of escaping the community center. I had no clear destination in mind. I just knew I had to get away from Cedar Falls as quickly as possible. I've never found out who set off that fire alarm, but I suspect it was someone else who had discovered what was really happening in Cedar Falls and tried to help me escape. I never went back to investigate, and I never reported what I'd seen to outside authorities. I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, and I was more afraid that Pastor Chen's influence might extend beyond the town boundaries. 6 months later, I found a news article online about Cedar Falls. The article described the town as a model community that had achieved remarkable social harmony through innovative civic engagement programs. Pastor Chen was quoted extensively, talking about how the Community Enhancement Society had transformed Cedar Falls into a place where individual desires align perfectly with collective needs. The article mentioned that Cedar Falls had been selected as a case study by a university research team investigating successful community development models. Plans were underway to replicate Cedar Falls programs in other small towns across the region. I still have nightmares about what I witnessed in that community center and what might have happened if that fire alarm hadn't gone off. But what terrifies me most is the possibility that Pastor Chen's vision of unity through surrender might actually be spreading to other communities, turning ordinary small towns into recruitment centers for his cult. Sometimes I wonder if I should have tried to help those visitors I saw being drugged and brainwashed. But then I remember the glassy-eyed compliance of the inner circle members, the perfect synchronization of the society audience, and the terrible peace in the voice of that young woman who thanked Pastor Chen for taking away her individual will. I moved to Seattle after leaving Cedar Falls, choosing a large city where I could disappear into the anonymity of urban life. But even now, 3 years later, I'm careful about getting too involved with community organizations or neighborhood groups. I've learned that the promise of belonging and purpose can hide the most dangerous kinds of control. If you ever find yourself in a small town where everyone seems unusually unified, where people talk about surrendering individual desires for collective good, where newcomers receive overwhelming attention and pressure to participate in community activities, be very, very careful. What looks like hospitality might be recruitment, and what seems like community spirit might be something much darker. The most effective cults don't operate in remote compounds or wear distinctive clothing. They hide in plain sight, disguised as civic organizations, religious groups, or community enhancement societies. They target people who are lonely, searching for meaning, or starting over in new places. They offer exactly what those people are looking for: belonging, purpose, and the promise that surrendering individual will can lead to peace and happiness. I never found out what happened to those visitors I saw being transformed in the community center. I never learned whether the other missing persons reports I'd found were connected to Pastor Chen's activities. But I do know that somewhere in Montana, there's a town where individual will has been surrendered to collective control, where ordinary people have given up their autonomy in exchange for the illusion of perfect community. And according to that news article, they're planning to expand. Story 2. The Inheritance. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I inherited something I never wanted from a grandmother I barely knew. When the lawyer called me in October 2021 to inform me about Grandmother Evelyn's death and the subsequent reading of her will, I honestly couldn't remember the last time I'd spoken to her. Evelyn Mitchell had been estranged from our family since before I was born. My father rarely mentioned her, and when he did, it was always with a mixture of anger and sadness that suggested old wounds had never properly healed. All I really knew about her was that she lived alone on a large property somewhere in rural Vermont, that she'd had some kind of falling out with my grandfather before I was born, and that she'd chosen to cut contact with the entire family sometime in the early 1980s. So I was surprised to learn that she'd left me her entire estate in her will. Not just surprised, shocked. We had no relationship, and as far as I knew, she had no reason to think kindly of me or to want me to inherit anything from her. The lawyer, a man named Harold Brennan, who sounded about 70 years old over the phone, explained that the estate consisted of a house, approximately 150 acres of land, and various personal possessions. He also mentioned that there were specific conditions attached to the inheritance that we would need to discuss in person. I was a 31-year-old graphic designer living in Boston at the time, working freelance and struggling to make ends meet in one of the country's most expensive cities. The idea of inheriting property, even property I'd never seen, was appealing from a financial standpoint. At the very least, I could sell whatever Evelyn had left me and use the proceeds to pay down my student loans and maybe put a down payment on a decent apartment. Harold Brennan's office was in a small town called Millfield, about 3 hours north of Boston. I drove up on a gray November morning, passing through increasingly rural landscape as I got further from the city. Millfield turned out to be one of those quintessential New England towns that look like postcards. White churches, maple trees, colonial architecture, and the kind of main street that probably hadn't changed much since the 1950s. Brennan's office was above a pharmacy in a building that had clearly been renovated many times over the decades. The stairs creaked as I climbed to the second floor, and the hallway smelled like old wood and the kind of cleaning products that are supposed to mask other odors but don't quite succeed. Harold Brennan looked exactly like he sounded on the phone. Elderly, distinguished in a rumpled sort of way, with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of cardigan that suggested he'd been practicing law since before I was born. His office was filled with filing cabinets, law books, and the accumulated paperwork of what appeared to be a very long career. "Miss Mitchell," he said, standing to shake my hand, "thank you for making the drive. Please have a seat. We have quite a bit to discuss." He opened a thick folder and withdrew several documents. "Your grandmother's will is unusual," he began. "She was very specific about certain requirements that must be met for you to inherit her estate." Harold handed me a copy of the will, which was written in the formal legal language I'd expected. But as I read through it, I began to understand why he described it as unusual. The will contained detailed instructions for what I had to do to claim my inheritance. First, I had to spend at least 30 consecutive days living in Evelyn's house. I couldn't just visit the property or stay overnight occasionally. I had to establish actual residence there for a full month. Second, during those 30 days, I had to maintain what the will described as the family traditions and observances that have been practiced at the property for generations. The will didn't specify what these traditions were, but it referenced a journal that Evelyn had left for me that would explain the requirements in detail. Third, I could not have any overnight guests during my 30-day residency period. I could have visitors during daylight hours, but no one else was allowed to sleep on the property while I was fulfilling the terms of the inheritance. Finally, if I failed to complete the 30-day residency period, or if I violated any of the other conditions, the entire estate would be donated to something called the Millfield Historical Preservation Society, and I would forfeit any claim to the inheritance. This is Very specific, I said after reading through the will twice. Did my grandmother explain why she included these requirements? Harold shrugged. Evelyn was a very private person with very particular ideas about family responsibility. She felt strongly that anyone who inherited her property should understand and respect the traditions associated with it. The way he said traditions made it sound like he was choosing his words carefully, as if there were things he wasn't allowed to say directly. What kind of traditions are we talking about? I asked. I'm afraid I can't provide details. Evelyn left specific instructions that you were to learn about the family observances through the journal she prepared for you. She was quite insistent that the knowledge be passed down in the traditional manner. This was getting stranger by the minute, but the potential financial benefits of the inheritance were significant. Harold provided me with an appraisal of the property that valued it at just over $400,000, which would completely change my financial situation if I could meet the terms of the will. Can I see the property before deciding whether to accept the inheritance? I asked. Of course. In fact, I'd recommend it. Here are the keys and directions to the house. Harold handed me an old-fashioned brass keyring with several keys attached. Take your time looking around. But remember, if you decide to proceed, you'll need to begin the 30-day residency period within 60 days of today's date. The drive to Evelyn's property took me further into rural Vermont, along increasingly narrow roads that wound through forests of bare trees and past farmhouses that looked like they'd been abandoned for decades. I began to understand why Evelyn had been able to live in isolation. This was the kind of place where you could go days without seeing another person if you wanted to. The property was marked by a mailbox with Mitchell painted in fading letters and a dirt driveway that disappeared into thick woods. I drove slowly along the winding drive for about a quarter mile before the trees opened up to reveal Evelyn's house. It was larger than I'd expected, a two-story colonial farmhouse that looked like it had been built in the early 1800s and maintained with care over the decades. The white paint was fresh, the roof appeared to be in good condition, and the surrounding grounds were neat and well-maintained. This didn't look like the home of an elderly recluse who had been estranged from her family for 40 years. I used Harold's keys to let myself inside, and my first impression was that someone had been living there very recently. The house was clean, furnished with antique pieces that looked both valuable and well cared for, and stocked with food and supplies as if Evelyn had just stepped out for the day. The kitchen was particularly impressive, a large farmhouse kitchen with modern appliances discreetly integrated among period-appropriate furnishings. The refrigerator was full of fresh food, the pantry was stocked with canned goods and dry supplies, and there was even fresh bread in a covered basket on the counter. This struck me as odd, since Harold had told me Evelyn died 3 weeks ago. Who had been maintaining the house and keeping it stocked with fresh food? The rest of the ground floor consisted of a living room, dining room, and a study that was lined floor to ceiling with books. The furniture was antique but comfortable, and everything was arranged with the kind of attention to detail that suggested Evelyn had taken great pride in her home. Upstairs were 4 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, all furnished and maintained to the same high standard as the rest of the house. The master bedroom, which I assumed had been Evelyn's, contained a large 4-poster bed, an antique wardrobe, and a writing desk positioned by the window overlooking the backyard. On the writing desk, I found a leather-bound journal with "For Sarah" written on the cover in elegant script. This was obviously the journal Harold had mentioned, the one that would explain the family traditions I'd need to observe during my 30-day residency period. I sat on the bed and opened the journal to the first page, which was dated just 2 months ago. Evelyn's handwriting was precise and easy to read, despite what must have been her advanced age. "My dear Sarah," the first entry began, "if you are reading this, then I have passed on, and you have chosen to consider claiming your inheritance. I hope you will forgive the unusual requirements I have placed on this bequest, but they are necessary to ensure that our family's responsibilities continue to be met." The entry went on to explain that the Mitchell family had lived on this property for 6 generations, and that during all that time, they had served as guardians and caretakers for something she referred to as The community. Our role, Evelyn wrote, has always been to provide support, resources, and sanctuary for the community during their times of need. In exchange, they have protected our family and ensured our prosperity. This is a sacred trust that must not be broken. I flipped through more pages, trying to understand what Evelyn meant by the community. The journal contained detailed instructions for various activities I would need to perform during my residency period, preparing specific meals on certain days, maintaining particular areas of the property, and observing what she called the evening protocols. The evening protocols seemed to involve going to specific locations on the property at sunset and performing various tasks, lighting candles, leaving food offerings, and reciting phrases that Evelyn had written out phonetically. She referred to these as the traditional observances that maintain harmony between our family and the community. None of this made much sense to me, but it sounded like the kind of folklore and superstition that might develop in an isolated, rural family over several generations. Vermont had a long history of eccentric individuals living unconventional lifestyles, and I figured this was probably just Evelyn's way of maintaining some family traditions that had become important to her over the years. The potential financial benefit of inheriting the property was significant, enough that I was willing to spend 30 days following my eccentric grandmother's instructions. Even if I didn't understand or believe in whatever she thought she was doing, I decided to accept the inheritance and began making plans to relocate to Vermont temporarily. I arranged to sublet my Boston apartment, transferred my work projects to a schedule that would allow me to work remotely, and loaded my car with everything I'd need for a month in the countryside. 3 weeks after my first visit to the property, I moved into Evelyn's house to begin my 30-day residency period. Harold Brennan had given me his contact information and told me to call if I had any questions or problems. But he also mentioned that cell phone reception was spotty in the area, and that I might need to use the house's landline for reliable communication. My first few days in the house were uneventful. I settled into the master bedroom, set up a workspace in the study, and began following Evelyn's journal instructions. The daily tasks were mostly mundane, preparing specific meals, tending to certain plants around the property, and maintaining various outdoor areas that Evelyn had marked on a hand-drawn map. The evening protocols were more elaborate but still seemed harmless. Each night at sunset, I would visit 3 specific locations on the property: a clearing about a quarter-mile behind the house, a large oak tree near the edge of the woods, and a stone structure that looked like it might have been an old root cellar or storage building. At each location, I would light candles that Evelyn had left prepared, place offerings of food and water, and recite the phrases she had written in her journal. The phrases seemed to be in some kind of archaic English, but they were mostly expressions of gratitude and respect for those who watch over us, and requests for continued protection and harmony. I felt somewhat foolish performing these rituals, but they were peaceful and meditative in their own way. The property was beautiful, especially at sunset, and there was something soothing about the routine of walking to the 3 locations each evening and taking time to appreciate the natural surroundings. On my 5th day in the house, I had my first indication that I might not be as alone on the property as I'd assumed. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when I heard voices outside. Not loud conversation, but the quiet murmur of people talking among themselves. I looked out the window but didn't see anyone, so I stepped out onto the back porch to investigate. The voices seemed to be coming from the direction of the stone structure where I performed one of my evening rituals. I could make out at least 3 different people, possibly more, engaged in what sounded like a calm discussion. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was conversational, not urgent or concerning. I assumed they were probably neighbors or perhaps hikers who were passing through the area. Rural Vermont had plenty of public hiking trails, and it wouldn't be unusual for people to walk through or near private property, especially if they were being respectful about it. I called out, "Hello, is anyone there?" But the voices stopped immediately. I waited for a few minutes, listening carefully, but didn't hear anything else. When I walked in the direction where I thought the voices had been coming from, I didn't find anyone. This struck me as slightly odd, but not particularly concerning. If there had been hikers on or near the property, they probably would have moved on once they realized they were close to someone's house. But over the next several days, I continued to hear voices at various times, always from different areas of the property, always just beyond my ability to see who was speaking. Sometimes the voices seemed to come from the woods behind the house, sometimes from the direction of the dirt road, sometimes from areas of the property I hadn't explored yet. The voices were always calm and conversational, never threatening or alarming. But they were also always just out of range of my ability to understand what was being said or to identify the speakers. And whenever I tried to approach the source of the voices, they would stop immediately. I began to suspect that there might be a community of people living in the woods around Evelyn's property. Vermont had a long tradition of people choosing to live off the grid in rural areas, and it was possible that there was a group of individuals who had established some kind of informal settlement in the forest. That would explain the voices, and it might also explain what Evelyn had meant in her journal when she referred to the community. Perhaps she had been providing food and supplies to people living in the woods around her property, and the evening rituals were her way of maintaining a relationship with them. This interpretation made me feel better about the situation. If Evelyn had been helping people in need, that was admirable, and I didn't mind continuing that tradition during my month on the property. The food offerings I left during my evening rituals were always gone by the next morning, which suggested that someone was indeed collecting them. On my 10th day in the house, I decided to explore more of the property to see if I could locate where the voices were coming from. Evelyn's hand-drawn map showed several paths through the woods, and I wanted to get a better sense of the layout of the land I was inheriting. I spent the afternoon hiking through the forested areas, following paths that were clearly well-maintained despite being unmarked. The trails led to several clearings, a small pond, and what looked like the remains of old farm buildings that had probably been abandoned decades ago. I also found evidence of recent human activity in several locations. There were fire rings in some of the clearings, with ashes that looked fresh. I found areas where the ground had been cleared and flattened, as if people had been camping there recently. Most intriguingly, I discovered what appeared to be a garden plot hidden deep in the woods, where someone was growing vegetables and herbs. The garden was well tended and clearly active. The plants were healthy and recently watered, and there were tools nearby that showed signs of regular use. Someone was definitely living in or regularly visiting the wooded areas around Evelyn's property. I was beginning to form a clearer picture of the situation. It seemed likely that there was indeed a community of people living in the woods around the house, possibly individuals who had chosen to live outside mainstream society for various reasons. Evelyn had apparently developed a relationship with them over the years, providing support and supplies in exchange for, what, protection? Company? Simply the satisfaction of helping people in need? The journal had mentioned that the community provided protection for the family in exchange for support. If there were people living in the woods who kept an eye on the property and discouraged trespassers or troublemakers, that could be valuable for someone living alone in such an isolated location. I decided to try a more direct approach to making contact. That evening, during my ritual at the stone structure, I spoke aloud to anyone who might be listening. "My name is Sarah Mitchell," I said. "I'm Evelyn's granddaughter, and I'm living in the house for the next few weeks. I'd like to meet you if you're willing. I want to understand how my grandmother helped your community, and I'd like to continue that relationship if possible." I left my usual offerings of food and water, but I also added a note with my name and the same message I'd spoken aloud. Then I returned to the house and waited to see if anyone would respond. The next morning, my note was gone, but there was no response. However, during my evening ritual that night, I found a note waiting for me at the stone structure. It was written on rough paper in handwriting I didn't recognize. "Sarah Mitchell, we knew you would come. Evelyn told us you would honor the old agreements. We will meet when you are ready. Complete the moon cycle, as Evelyn taught you. Then we will speak. I wasn't sure what complete the moon cycle meant, but when I checked Evelyn's journal, I found a section I had skipped over that dealt with monthly observances tied to the lunar calendar. According to her notes, there were special rituals that needed to be performed during the new moon, and the next new moon was scheduled for 5 days later. The monthly observances were more elaborate than the daily evening protocols. They involved spending the entire night outdoors at specific locations on the property, maintaining fires, and performing extended rituals that lasted from sunset to sunrise. Evelyn's journal contained pages of instructions for these ceremonies, including specific words to recite, offerings to prepare, and actions to perform at different times throughout the night. I was nervous about spending an entire night outdoors alone, especially given that there were clearly people living in the woods around the property who I hadn't actually met yet. But I was also curious to learn more about the community and to understand what my grandmother had been involved in all these years. On the night of the new moon, I prepared for the monthly observance according to Evelyn's detailed instructions. I gathered supplies for maintaining fires at 3 different locations, prepared specific food offerings, and dressed in white clothing as the journal specified. The rituals began at sunset, with the lighting of fires at the clearing behind the house, the large oak tree, and the stone structure. I was supposed to visit each location in sequence throughout the night, performing different ceremonies at each site and maintaining the fires until sunrise. As darkness fell, I began to feel less confident about spending the night alone outdoors. The sounds of the forest seemed louder and more ominous than they had during my previous evening rituals. Every rustle in the leaves, every branch creaking in the wind, every distant animal sound made me jump, but I was committed to completing the monthly observance, both because the journal suggested it was necessary for maintaining the relationship with the community, and because I wanted to see if anyone would actually meet with me, as the note had promised. Around midnight, as I was tending the fire at the oak tree location, I heard footsteps approaching through the woods. Unlike the distant voices I'd been hearing for the past week, these footsteps were clearly coming toward me, making no attempt at concealment. 3 figures emerged from the darkness into the circle of light cast by my fire. They were dressed in simple, dark clothing that looked handmade, and they moved with the quiet confidence of people who spent a lot of time in the woods. 2 men and 1 woman, all appearing to be middle-aged, all watching me with expressions that seemed curious but cautious. "Sarah Mitchell," the woman said. It was a statement, not a question. "You are Evelyn's heir?" "Yes," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite my nervousness. "Thank you for meeting with me. I'd like to understand what my grandmother's relationship with your community involved." The 3 exchanged glances before the woman continued. "Your grandmother honored the old agreements. For 43 years, she provided shelter, supplies, and sanctuary when we needed them. In return, we protected her property and her person from those who would do harm." "What kind of harm?" I asked. "There are those who do not understand our ways," one of the men said. "Government officials who would force us to live according to their rules. Religious zealots who condemn our practices as evil. Developers who want to turn our forest home into houses and shopping centers. Your grandmother's support allowed us to resist these pressures." This was starting to sound more complex than I'd initially imagined. "What exactly are your ways? What practices are you talking about?" The woman smiled, but there was something unsettling about the expression. "We follow the old paths, Sarah Mitchell. We honor the traditions that existed in these woods long before the European settlers arrived. We maintain the balance between the human world and the natural world. We are the guardians of ancient knowledge," the second man added. "Knowledge that has been preserved through centuries of persecution and suppression. Your grandmother understood this and respected our sacred mission." Their language was becoming more elaborate and mystical, which made me uncomfortable. I'd been hoping to find a straightforward community of people living off the grid, but this was starting to sound like something more complicated and potentially problematic. What specific support did my grandmother provide? I asked, trying to steer the conversation toward concrete details. Sanctuary when we needed to disappear, the woman replied. Storage for sacred materials that required protection. Meeting spaces for ceremonies that could not be performed in the deep woods. And supplies, food, medical materials, tools, communication equipment. We maintained contact with other communities like ours across New England and beyond. Your grandmother allowed us to use her landline and internet connection when necessary. This was beginning to sound like more than just helping people live off the grid. If they were part of some kind of network of communities with shared practices and communication needs, that suggested a more organized and potentially concerning situation. What would you expect from me if I decided to continue my grandmother's support? I asked. The three exchanged glances again, and I had the feeling they were communicating in ways I couldn't perceive. The same arrangement, the woman said finally. We would continue to protect your property and your person. In return, you would provide sanctuary, storage, and supplies when needed. You would honor the daily and monthly observances that maintain harmony between our communities. And if I decided not to continue the arrangement, the mood shifted noticeably. All three figures became more still, more watchful, and the woman's voice took on a colder tone. That would be unfortunate, Sarah Mitchell. Your grandmother's property sits at the center of territory we have claimed for over 2 centuries. We have invested considerable effort in protecting this area from outside interference. It would be difficult to allow someone unsympathetic to our cause to control such a strategic location. This was starting to sound like a threat. What exactly would happen if I decided to sell the property or move away? We would do what we have always done to protect our interests, the second man said. We would ensure that the property remained under the control of T, someone who understands and respects our traditional claims. I was getting the distinct impression that I was being told I didn't actually have a choice about continuing my grandmother's arrangement with these people. They were presenting it as a mutually beneficial relationship. But the underlying message seemed to be that they would not allow me to simply walk away from the property with my inheritance. I need some time to think about this, I said. Of course, the woman replied, but her tone suggested this was a formality rather than a real option. Continue the daily observances while you consider your decision. We will meet again at the next full moon to discuss your commitment. The three figures melted back into the darkness as quietly as they had appeared, leaving me alone with my fire and a growing sense of unease about what I had gotten myself into. I completed the monthly observance as Evelyn's journal instructed, maintaining the fires and performing the prescribed rituals until sunrise. But my mind was racing with questions and concerns about the community and their expectations. Over the next few days, I researched everything I could find about cults, communes, and alternative religious groups in Vermont. What I discovered was disturbing. Vermont had a long history of groups that started as intentional communities or spiritual movements, but evolved into controlling, manipulative organizations that exploited their members and sometimes engaged in illegal activities. Many of these groups were skilled at presenting themselves as harmless spiritual seekers or environmental activists while hiding more troubling practices. They often targeted isolated rural properties where they could operate without scrutiny, and they were known for using intimidation and coercion to maintain control over people and resources they considered important to their mission. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that the community was not the benign group of forest dwellers I had initially imagined. Their talk of ancient knowledge, sacred missions, and protecting traditional claims sounded like the kind of rhetoric used by groups that had developed dangerous ideologies around racial purity, anti-government extremism, or apocalyptic religious beliefs. Most concerning was their obvious expectation that I would continue providing support regardless of my personal feelings about their activities. They had made it clear that they considered the property to be under their control, and that they would not allow me to simply inherit it and leave. I began to understand why my grandmother had been estranged from the family for so many years. She hadn't chosen isolation. She had been trapped by her relationship with the community, unable to leave or to bring outsiders into a situation that was probably illegal and definitely dangerous. By including the 30-day residency requirement in her will, Evelyn had ensured that her heir would be drawn into the same relationship she had been trapped in. The inheritance was not a gift, it was a trap, a way of ensuring that the community would continue to have access to the property and resources they needed. I realized I had to get away from the property before the full moon, when the community expected to meet with me again and receive my commitment to continue the arrangement. But I also knew they were watching the property and would probably try to prevent me from leaving if they suspected I was planning to abandon the inheritance. I decided to wait until the night before the full moon, then leave quietly and drive back to Boston. I would forfeit the inheritance, but I would be free from whatever entanglement my grandmother had created. On my 22nd day at the property, I packed my essential belongings and prepared to leave early the next morning. I went through the motions of my usual evening rituals to avoid arousing suspicion, but I planned to be gone before dawn. That night, I was awakened around 2 a.m. by voices outside the house. Not the distant conversations I'd been hearing for weeks, but loud, urgent discussion happening very close to my bedroom window. I crept to the window and peered through the curtains. At least a dozen people were gathered in the yard behind the house, far more than I had realized were living in the area. They were dressed in the same dark handmade clothing I'd seen on the three representatives, and they were clearly agitated about something. I couldn't make out everything they were saying, but I caught fragments of their conversation. She's planning to leave, betraying the agreement. Can't allow the property to fall into outside hands, same as we did with the others. The phrase, same as we did with the others, sent a chill down my spine. It suggested that I wasn't the first person to try to break away from the community's control, and that they had dealt with previous situations in ways that hadn't ended well for the people involved. I realized I couldn't wait until morning to leave. I had to get away from the property immediately, while there was still a chance of escaping without a confrontation. I grabbed my car keys and the small bag I'd packed, then crept downstairs as quietly as possible. The voices were still active outside, but they seemed to be concentrated in the backyard, which might give me a chance to reach my car without being seen. I made it to the front door and was starting to turn the handle when someone knocked. 3 slow, deliberate knocks that echoed through the quiet house. I froze, hoping that whoever was outside would assume I was asleep and go away. But the knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Sarah Mitchell," a voice called through the door. I recognized it as the woman who had spoken for the community during our midnight meeting. "We need to speak with you." "Open the door." I didn't respond, but I heard footsteps moving around the house, and I realized the community members were positioning themselves to prevent me from leaving through any of the exits. "Sarah," the woman's voice came again, but now it was coming from the back door. "You cannot leave until we have resolved the question of your commitment to the arrangement. Open the door, and we will discuss this reasonably." I was trapped inside the house, surrounded by people who had made it clear they wouldn't allow me to simply walk away from my grandmother's property. I had no cell phone reception to call for help, and the nearest neighbors were probably miles away. I decided my only option was to try to bluff my way out of the situation. I went to the back door and spoke through it without opening it. "I need more time to make my decision," I said. "I'm not ready to make a commitment yet." "Time is what we no longer have," the woman replied. "Other forces are moving that threaten our security. We need to know now whether you will honor your grandmother's agreements or whether we need to make alternative arrangements." Alternative arrangements sounded ominous, but I tried to maintain a calm tone. "What kind of other forces?" "Government investigators have been asking questions about disappearances in this area. They are getting close to discovering our presence, which means we may need to relocate quickly. If that happens, we will need to ensure that no one who knows about our activities is left behind to provide information to the authorities." My blood ran cold. They were telling me that if they had to abandon the area, they would take me with them or eliminate me as a potential witness to their activities. This wasn't about spiritual practices or environmental activism. This was about covering up crimes. I understand, I said, trying to buy time while I figured out what to do. I want to honor my grandmother's agreements, but I need to understand exactly what's expected of me. Open the door, Sarah Mitchell. We will explain everything. I knew that if I opened that door, I would never leave the property alive. Whatever the community was really doing, whatever crimes they had committed, they couldn't afford to let someone with knowledge of their activities return to the outside world. I backed away from the door and tried to think of alternatives. The house had a landline phone, but when I checked, the line was dead. They had obviously cut the phone connection to prevent me from calling for help. I was running out of options when I remembered something from my exploration of the property. The old farm buildings I'd found in the woods included what looked like a root cellar or storm shelter. If I could get out of the house without being seen, I might be able to hide there until the community gave up searching for me. The front of the house faced away from where most of the voices seemed to be concentrated. If I could get out a front window quietly, I might be able to reach the woods and make my way to the old farm buildings. I crept to the living room and carefully opened one of the windows that faced the front yard. I could hear voices coming from behind the house, but I couldn't see anyone in the front yard. I climbed out the window as quietly as possible and ran for the tree line. I made it about 50 yards before I heard shouts behind me. Someone had seen me leaving the house, and now the entire community was mobilizing to track me down. I could hear at least a dozen people crashing through the woods behind me, calling to each other and coordinating their search. I ran as hard as I could toward where I remembered seeing the old farm buildings, but I was running in darkness through unfamiliar forest while being pursued by people who knew the area intimately. I knew they would probably catch up with me before I could find a good hiding place. But I had one advantage. During my afternoon hikes, I had noticed that there were old logging roads throughout the forest, some of which seemed to connect to the main road that led away from the property. If I could reach one of those roads, I might be able to find my way back to civilization. I veered away from the direction of the farm buildings and headed for where I thought the nearest logging road might be. Behind me, I could hear the community members spreading out and systematically searching the forest. They were organized and methodical, which suggested they had done this before. I found a logging road, but it was overgrown and difficult to follow in the darkness. I stumbled along it for what felt like hours, guided only by the slightly lighter color of the packed earth under the vegetation. Several times I heard voices nearby and had to hide in the underbrush until the search parties moved past me. Eventually, the logging road intersected with what looked like a more substantial dirt road. I followed that for another hour until I finally reached a paved highway. I was exhausted, terrified, and had no idea where I was. But I was away from the property and the community. I walked along the highway until I found a house with the lights on, where I was able to convince the residents to let me use their phone to call the police. I told them I had been hiking and gotten lost in the woods, which was partly true. When the police arrived, I gave them a more detailed version of what had happened, though I was careful not to mention anything about cults or illegal activities until I could be sure they would take me seriously. They drove me back to collect my car from Evelyn's property, but when we arrived, the house was dark and empty. My car was still in the driveway, but it wouldn't start. Someone had disabled it to prevent me from leaving. The police searched the property, but found no signs of the community members I had described. The house looked exactly as it had when I had first visited it with Harold Brennan, giving no indication that anyone had been living there or that a dozen people had been conducting a search through the surrounding woods just hours earlier. The police were polite but skeptical about my story. They arranged for a tow truck to collect my disabled car and gave me a ride to a motel in Millfield, where I spent the rest of the night trying to decide what to do next. The next morning, I called Harold Brennan and told him I was forfeiting my claim to the inheritance. I didn't provide details about why I was making that decision, but I made it clear that I would not be completing the 30-day residency requirement and that I wanted the estate donated to the Millfield Historical Preservation Society as specified in the will. Harold seemed surprised but didn't ask too many questions. He arranged for my car to be repaired and returned to me. And within 2 days, I was driving back to Boston, eager to put the entire experience behind me, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I had discovered at Evelyn's property. The community was clearly involved in illegal activities, possibly including the disappearances they had mentioned. If they were part of a network of similar groups, they might be responsible for crimes across multiple states. I struggled with whether to report what I had experienced to federal authorities. I had no physical evidence of the community's existence, and my brief encounter with them hadn't provided enough detail to support serious criminal charges. I was also afraid that reporting the situation might bring me to the attention of the community's network, potentially putting me in danger. In the end, I decided to document everything I could remember about my experience and keep that documentation as insurance in case I ever needed it. I also researched the Millfield Historical Preservation Society to see who would be receiving Evelyn's property. What I found was disturbing. The Millfield Historical Preservation Society had been founded 12 years ago by a group of local residents interested in protecting the area's traditional heritage. The organization's stated mission was to prevent outside interference with the indigenous cultural practices that had been maintained in the area for generations. The language was similar to what I had heard from the community representatives, and several of the organization's founding members had names that I recognized from my research into Vermont alternative religious groups. It seemed likely that the Historical Preservation Society was actually a front organization created by the community to take legal control of properties they wanted to access. By forfeiting my inheritance, I had essentially handed over legal ownership of Evelyn's property to the very people I had been trying to escape from. They would now have permanent official control of the land they had been using for their activities, and they would be protected from future interference by property owners who might not be sympathetic to their cause. I realized that Evelyn's will had been carefully designed to serve the community's interests regardless of whether her heir chose to cooperate with them. If I had stayed and agreed to continue the arrangement, they would have maintained access to the property through my cooperation. If I left and forfeited the inheritance, they would gain legal ownership through their front organization. Either way, they won. It's been 3 years since I left Evelyn's property, and I still have nightmares about that night in the woods. I've never contacted Harold Brennan or tried to learn more about what happened to the estate after I forfeited my claim, but sometimes I search online for news about disappearances in rural Vermont, and I've found several cases that seem similar to what the community described. People who visit remote areas and simply vanish, leaving no trace except for abandoned cars and belongings. Hikers who set out on well-marked trails and are never seen again. Tourists who check into rural hotels and disappear before checkout time. I can't prove that these disappearances are connected to the community or to similar groups operating in New England, but I can't shake the feeling that there are networks of dangerous people operating in remote areas, using isolation and intimidation to maintain control over territory and resources while hiding their activities from law enforcement. I never learned what specific crimes the community was involved in, but their behavior made it clear they were willing to use violence to protect their secrets. Their network of communication with other groups suggests that this might be a larger problem than anyone realizes. If you ever inherit property in a remote area, especially if the inheritance comes with unusual conditions or requirements, be very careful about accepting it. Research the area thoroughly and pay attention to any signs that other people might have claims or expectations regarding the property. And if you ever encounter people who talk about traditional practices, ancient knowledge, or protecting indigenous heritage in areas where those claims don't make historical sense, consider the possibility that you might be dealing with a group that has adopted that language to disguise activities that are neither traditional nor legal. Some inheritances come with obligations that the previous owner couldn't escape from, and they may be trying to pass those same obligations to you. Make sure you understand what you're accepting before you commit to anything that might be difficult to walk away from. Story 3. The Research Project. My name is Dr. Jennifer Walsh, and I'm a cultural anthropologist who spent 15 years studying alternative religious movements in the American Southwest. I thought I understood how these groups operated, how they recruited members, and how they maintained control over their followers. I was wrong. In the summer of 2022, I received a research grant to study what my academic colleagues referred to as neo-indigenous spiritual communities, groups that claim to be reviving ancient Native American practices, but were actually modern constructions led by non-Native individuals. These groups had been growing in popularity, particularly in Arizona and New Mexico, and my grant was specifically focused on documenting their beliefs and practices. The research seemed straightforward. I would spend 6 months visiting various communities, conducting interviews, observing ceremonies, and documenting how these groups adapted traditional spiritual practices for modern practitioners. My goal was to produce an academic paper that would contribute to the understanding of how authentic cultural traditions become commercialized and transformed by outsider communities. I had already completed preliminary research on 12 different groups when I was contacted by someone calling himself Thomas Crow Feather, who claimed to represent a community called the Desert Wind people. He had heard about my research through academic networks and invited me to visit their settlement in the remote mountains of northern New Mexico. Thomas explained that his community was different from the other groups I had been studying. Rather than adapting Native American practices, he claimed they were direct descendants of indigenous peoples who had maintained their traditional ways continuously for over 500 years, despite centuries of persecution and cultural suppression. "We have never abandoned the old ways," Thomas told me during our initial phone conversation. "We have kept the ceremonies, the knowledge, and the spiritual practices that our ancestors taught us, but we have had to remain hidden to protect ourselves from those who would destroy or exploit our traditions." This was exactly the kind of claim that my research was designed to investigate. Groups that falsely claimed indigenous heritage were a particular concern in academic circles, as they often exploited both their own members and genuine Native communities while profiting from the sale of spiritual services and ceremonial artifacts. But Thomas's invitation also represented an opportunity to document a potentially authentic traditional community that had remained isolated from mainstream anthropological study. If his claims were true, the Desert Wind people could provide valuable insight into how indigenous cultures had adapted and survived in the face of historical oppression. Thomas provided me with detailed directions to reach their community, which was located in a remote canyon system about 4 hours north of Santa Fe. The area was accessible only by four-wheel drive vehicles, and even then, the final approach required a several-mile hike through desert terrain. "We maintain our isolation deliberately," Thomas explained. "Too much contact with the outside world weakens the spiritual energy that protects our community. We allow very few outsiders to visit, and only those who demonstrate proper respect for our ways." I was intrigued by the community's apparent commitment to maintaining traditional isolation, even though it made my research logistically challenging. I arranged to spend 2 weeks with the Desert Wind people, bringing camping equipment and supplies for an extended stay in remote conditions. The drive to the Desert Wind community took me through increasingly desolate landscape, along dirt roads that showed little evidence of regular use. The final hour of driving required navigating rocky terrain that barely qualified as a road, and I began to understand why the community had remained isolated from outside contact. I parked my vehicle at coordinates Thomas had provided and began the hike to the community's location. The trail was marked only by small stone cairns placed at irregular intervals, and it wound through a landscape of red rock formations, desert scrub, and scattered juniper trees. After about 3 hours of hiking, I reached a narrow canyon entrance that had been nearly invisible from a distance. The trail descended into the canyon, following a seasonal creek bed toward what I hoped was the Desert Wind settlement. The community, when I finally found it, was impressive in its integration with the natural environment. About 30 structures were built into the canyon walls and scattered across the canyon floor, constructed from local stone and timber in architectural styles that appeared to blend traditional indigenous techniques with practical adaptations for desert living. The buildings looked ancient, weathered by decades or possibly centuries of exposure to sun and wind, but they were also clearly inhabited and well-maintained, with signs of recent construction and repair work that suggested an active, thriving community. Thomas Crow Feather met me at the canyon entrance as I arrived. He was a man in his 60s with long gray hair, weathered skin, and traditional Native American clothing that looked handmade rather than purchased from commercial sources. His presence was commanding but not intimidating, and he greeted me with the kind of formal courtesy I associated with indigenous elders. "Dr. Walsh," he said, "welcome to our home. We are honored to share our ways with someone who seeks to understand rather than to judge or exploit." Thomas led me through the settlement, introducing me to other community members and explaining the function of various buildings and areas. There was a central plaza used for ceremonies, workshops where traditional crafts were practiced, a school where children learned indigenous languages and customs, and residential areas organized around extended family groups. The community appeared to be home to about 120 people of various ages, from infants to elderly individuals who, according to Thomas, were the keepers of the most ancient knowledge and traditions. Everyone I met was dressed in traditional clothing, spoke indigenous languages among themselves, and showed the kind of deep familiarity with their environment that suggested they had lived there for many years. What struck me most was the absence of modern technology or conveniences. There were no electrical lines, no motorized vehicles, no plastic or mass-manufactured items visible anywhere in the settlement. The community seemed to be living exactly as their ancestors might have lived centuries ago, sustained entirely by traditional knowledge and practices. Thomas arranged for me to stay in a small guest house that had been constructed specifically for the rare occasions when outsiders were permitted to visit. The structure was built in traditional style, but included some basic amenities: a bed, a writing desk, and storage space for my research equipment. Over my first few days in the community, I began conducting interviews with various members about their history, beliefs, and practices. What I learned was fascinating and, in some ways, troubling. According to the oral histories I collected, the Desert Wind people were indeed descendants of indigenous groups that had lived in the region for centuries. But their story was not one of continuous occupation. Rather, they described a pattern of periodic diaspora and return that had characterized their relationship with the canyon for over 200 years. When the Spanish came, we went into hiding, an elderly woman named Maria Singingbird told me. When the Americans came, we scattered again. When the government tried to force our children into schools, we disappeared into the deep desert. But we always came back to this place when it was safe. The community's oral history described cycles of persecution that had forced them to abandon their traditional homeland temporarily, living as refugees in remote areas until it was safe to return. During these periods of exile, they had maintained their cultural practices in secret, passing down knowledge and traditions through families that remained connected despite geographical separation. "We learned to become invisible," Thomas explained. "To survive, we had to master the art of existing without being seen by those who would destroy us. We became experts at living in places where others could not find us, at obtaining what we needed without participating in the outside economy." This narrative of survival through invisibility was compelling, and it seemed to explain how an indigenous community could have maintained traditional ways while remaining unknown to mainstream anthropological research. But as I spent more time in the community, I began to notice details that didn't fit with the story I was being told. The most obvious inconsistency was the community's apparent self-sufficiency. They claim to live entirely through traditional hunting, gathering, and small-scale agriculture without any connection to outside economic systems. But the nutritional and material needs of 120 people could not be met through the resources available in their immediate environment, especially during winter months when the desert provided minimal food sources. When I asked about how they obtained tools, clothing, and other manufactured items that I could see throughout the community, I was told that they traded with other indigenous communities and that they had maintained traditional crafting knowledge that allowed them to produce everything they needed, but some of the items I observed were clearly of recent manufacture. Metal tools showed machine-produced precision that could not have been achieved through traditional smithing techniques. Fabrics had synthetic characteristics that suggested industrial production. Even the traditional clothing worn by community members included elements that appeared to be made from modern materials. More concerning were inconsistencies in the cultural knowledge and practices I was documenting. While community members were fluent in what they claimed were ancient indigenous languages, linguistic analysis of recorded conversations revealed vocabulary and grammatical structures that suggested relatively recent construction rather than organic language evolution. Similarly, the ceremonies and spiritual practices I was permitted to observe contained elements from multiple distinct indigenous traditions, combined in ways that seemed artificial rather than the result of natural cultural development. It was as if someone had researched various Native American spiritual practices and assembled them into a synthetic tradition that appeared authentic to outsiders, but lacked the coherence that comes from genuine cultural continuity. I began to suspect that the Desert Wind people were not the authentic indigenous community they claimed to be. But I also couldn't figure out what their actual purpose might be. They weren't charging fees for spiritual services or selling ceremonial artifacts, which were the most common motives for groups that falsely claimed Native American identity. They weren't recruiting new members or proselytizing for their beliefs. They seemed genuinely committed to maintaining their isolation and privacy. If they were not an authentic indigenous community, what were they? And why had they created such an elaborate deception? My questions became more urgent when I began to notice signs that the community was engaged in activities they hadn't told me about. During my interviews, people would sometimes reference work or responsibilities that took them away from the canyon for days or weeks at a time. When I asked for details about these activities, I was told they involved sacred duties that could not be discussed with outsiders. I also noticed that certain areas of the canyon were clearly off-limits to visitors. There were paths leading to sections of the settlement that I was not permitted to explore, and buildings that I was told served ceremonial purposes that were too sacred to be observed by non-community members. These restrictions were not necessarily suspicious. Many indigenous communities have sacred spaces and practices that are appropriately kept private from outsiders. But combined with the other inconsistencies I had noticed, they suggested that the Desert Wind people might be hiding activities that had nothing to do with traditional spiritual practices. My suspicions intensified when I realized that several community members were absent for most of my visit. Thomas had introduced me to about 30 people during my first days in the canyon, but I was told that the rest of the community was engaged in seasonal activities that required them to be away from the settlement. When I asked about the nature of these seasonal activities, I was given vague explanations about traditional hunting and gathering practices that required small groups to travel throughout the region following animal migrations and plant cycles. But the timing didn't match what I knew about resource availability in the desert ecosystem, and the number of people involved seemed disproportionate to the activities described. After a week in the community, I decided to attempt some unauthorized exploration to try to understand what was really happening in the areas I had been restricted from visiting. I waited until the middle of the night, then left my guest house and began following one of the paths that led to the off-limits section of the canyon. The path wound deeper into the canyon system through areas that were darker and more secluded than the main settlement. After about a mile of careful hiking, I began to see artificial lights in the distance, not the oil lamps and fires that were used in the main community, but electric lights that indicated the presence of modern technology. As I got closer, I could hear the sound of generators running, and I began to smell chemical odors that had no place in a traditional indigenous settlement. I crept as close as I dared and found myself looking down into a hidden valley where the desert wind people were engaged in industrial-scale drug production. The valley contained several large buildings that had been camouflaged to blend into the landscape when viewed from above, but which housed sophisticated chemical processing equipment. Dozens of people were working in shifts, operating machinery and handling materials in ways that clearly required specialized training and experience. This was not a traditional indigenous community that had maintained ancient ways in isolation. This was a drug manufacturing operation that had created an elaborate cover story to explain their presence in a remote location and to discourage outside investigation. I was still trying to process what I was seeing when someone grabbed me from behind. Before I could scream or struggle, a hand was clamped over my mouth, and I was dragged away from the overlook. My captor turned out to be Thomas Crow Feather, but he looked very different from the dignified elder who had welcomed me to the community. His traditional clothing had been replaced by modern work clothes, and his demeanor had shifted from spiritual guide to efficient criminal. "Dr. Walsh," he said quietly, "I really wish you hadn't seen that. Now we have a problem." Thomas led me to a small building I hadn't seen before, where several other community members were waiting. But like Thomas, they had abandoned their traditional appearance and were dressed in contemporary clothing that suggested they were more familiar with industrial work than with indigenous spiritual practices. "We need to discuss your research," Thomas said as we entered the building, "and how it's going to be completed." The building turned out to be equipped with modern furniture and electronic equipment, including computers and communication devices that were obviously connected to outside networks. This was clearly the real command center of the operation, hidden beneath the facade of traditional living that was presented to visitors. Thomas sat behind a desk and regarded me with an expression that was calculating rather than hostile. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, Ph.D. in Cultural Anthropology from the University of Chicago. 15 years of experience studying alternative religious movements, author of 3 books and 17 peer-reviewed articles on indigenous spiritual practices. No immediate family, few close personal relationships. Work that requires extensive travel to remote locations. The fact that he knew so much about my background was alarming, but his tone suggested this was a business discussion rather than a threat. "We researched you thoroughly before extending our invitation," Thomas continued. "We needed an academic with the right credentials and personal situation to serve our purposes." "What purposes?" I asked. "Legitimacy," Thomas replied. "Our operation requires a certain amount of interaction with outside authorities, environmental agencies, tribal governments, law enforcement. Having a respected academic researcher document our presence as an authentic indigenous community provides us with protection and credibility." I was beginning to understand the scope of what I had stumbled into. The Desert Wind people weren't just manufacturing drugs, they were using false claims of indigenous identity as a cover story that would protect them from investigation and provide legal justification for their presence in the area. "Your research report will document our community as a previously unknown indigenous group that has maintained traditional ways for centuries," Thomas explained. "Your academic reputation will give credibility to our claims, and your published work will create a permanent record that we can reference if our legitimacy is ever questioned." "And if I refuse to write such a report?" Thomas's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the atmosphere of the room. The other people present moved slightly, positioning themselves in ways that suggested they were prepared to restrain me if necessary. That would be unfortunate. "Dr. Walsh, we've invested considerable time and resources in creating this scenario, and we need your cooperation to complete it successfully. You're asking me to commit academic fraud and to help you maintain a criminal operation. We're asking you to do the work. You came here to document our community and our practices. The fact that you've discovered additional activities doesn't change the basic nature of your research assignment. Thomas leaned back in his chair and adopted a more conversational tone. Dr. Walsh, you've spent 15 years studying communities that make false claims about indigenous identity for commercial purposes. You've documented how these groups exploit both their own members and authentic Native communities. You understand the difference between genuine cultural preservation and cultural appropriation. He gestured toward the window, in the direction of the main settlement. What you've seen in our community is not cultural appropriation. It's not exploitation of indigenous traditions for profit or spiritual tourism. It's a carefully constructed protective fiction that allows us to operate in peace while harming no one, except for the people who use the drugs you're manufacturing. We produce pharmaceutical precursors that are sold to legitimate medical research companies, Thomas replied smoothly. We're not manufacturing street drugs or contributing to addiction epidemics. We're part of a supply chain that supports medical research and development. I didn't believe this explanation, but I also realized that arguing about the ethics of their operation was not going to improve my situation. I was trapped in a remote location with people who had created an elaborate criminal enterprise and who needed my cooperation to maintain their cover story. What exactly do you want from me? I asked. Complete your research as planned, Thomas said. Document our community, our practices, and our history according to the information we've provided. Publish your findings in academic journals and present them at professional conferences. Help establish our legitimacy as an authentic indigenous community that deserves protection and recognition. And then you return to your normal academic career, with the understanding that you have contributed to the preservation of an endangered cultural tradition. We continue our work with the protection your research has provided. Thomas opened a desk drawer and withdrew a thick folder. We've prepared comprehensive background materials to support your research, oral histories, genealogical records, linguistic documentation, and cultural artifacts that demonstrate the authenticity of our traditions. I recognized that the materials Thomas was showing me represented months or years of careful preparation. These people had invested enormous resources in creating a false indigenous identity that would be convincing enough to fool academic researchers and government officials. How long have you been planning this? I asked. 5 years of preparation before we contacted you, Thomas replied. We needed time to develop the cultural knowledge, construct the physical environment, and identify the right researcher to legitimize our claims. The scope of the deception was staggering. They had built an entire fake community, developed artificial cultural traditions, and researched my personal and professional background to determine that I would be the ideal person to provide academic credibility for their operation. What happens if I agree to cooperate, but then expose your operation after I leave? Thomas smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. Dr. Walsh, you've been living in our community for over a week, documenting our practices and interviewing our members. You've collected extensive research materials and formed personal relationships with people you believe to be authentic indigenous practitioners. He paused to let the implication sink in. If you were to later claim that everything you witnessed was an elaborate hoax, what would that do to your professional reputation? Who would believe that a respected anthropologist with 15 years of experience could be so thoroughly deceived? I realized he was right. If I exposed the Desert Wind people as a fake indigenous community, I would also be exposing myself as a researcher who had been completely fooled by their deception. My academic career would be destroyed, and my credibility as an expert on alternative religious movements would be permanently undermined. You've designed this scenario to ensure that I have no choice but to cooperate, I said. We've designed this scenario to create a mutually beneficial relationship, Thomas corrected. You get research materials for a successful academic publication that will advance your career. We get the legitimacy we need to continue our work without interference. Thomas stood up and moved to the window, looking out toward the main settlement where community members were going through the motions of traditional daily life. Dr. Walsh, What you've seen here is actually quite remarkable from an anthropological perspective. We've created a complete cultural identity from scratch, developed it with enough depth and consistency to fool expert researchers, and implemented it successfully in a real-world environment. He turned back to face me. In many ways, what we've accomplished is exactly the kind of cultural construction that you've spent your career studying. The only difference is that we've been honest with you about our motives. I spent the next 3 days completing my research according to Thomas's requirements, interviewing community members about their fabricated history and documenting their artificial cultural practices. The materials they provided were impressively detailed and professionally prepared, creating a coherent narrative about indigenous survival and cultural preservation. But I also began to notice additional details that suggested the operation was even more extensive than I had initially realized. References to other communities, coordination with outside organizations, and communication networks that implied the Desert Wind people were part of a larger criminal enterprise. When I asked Thomas about these connections, he was vague, but not evasive. "We work with other groups that share our need for privacy and autonomy," he said. "There are many communities throughout the Southwest that have chosen to operate outside mainstream society for various reasons. We provide mutual support and assistance when needed." This suggested that the false indigenous identity was being used by multiple criminal organizations, possibly as part of a coordinated strategy to avoid law enforcement attention by claiming protected cultural status. On my final day in the community, Thomas provided me with a complete set of research materials to support the academic paper I would be expected to publish. The materials included historical documents, linguistic analyses, photographic evidence, and recorded interviews that would create a comprehensive foundation for claims about the Desert Wind people's authenticity. "Take your time with the publication process," Thomas advised. "Thorough research requires careful analysis and peer review. But we do expect to see your preliminary findings presented at the American Anthropological Association conference next year." As I prepared to leave the canyon, Thomas made one final point that clarified the seriousness of my situation. "Dr. Walsh, I hope you understand that your safety and ours now depend on your continued cooperation. We've shared sensitive information with you because we trust your professionalism and discretion. We expect that trust to be honored." The implied threat was clear. If I exposed their operation, they would consider me a security risk that needed to be eliminated. I hiked out of the canyon carrying research materials that documented a completely fictional indigenous community, committed to publishing academic work that I knew to be fraudulent, and trapped in a situation where my professional survival required my cooperation with a criminal enterprise. 6 months later, I published a paper titled "The Desert Wind People: Cultural Survival and Adaptation Among Hidden Indigenous Communities of the American Southwest." The paper was well received by academic colleagues and contributed to my reputation as an expert on indigenous cultural preservation. But I also began researching other academic papers about newly discovered indigenous communities, looking for signs that other researchers might have been manipulated in similar ways. What I found was disturbing. Over the past 10 years, at least 6 academic papers had been published documenting indigenous communities that claimed to have maintained traditional ways in isolation for centuries. These communities were located throughout the Southwest, all in remote areas that would be suitable for concealing illegal activities, and all had been discovered by respected researchers who had been specifically invited to study them. The communities described in these papers shared similar characteristics: claims of continuous cultural preservation, sophisticated traditional practices, and strong commitments to maintaining privacy and isolation from outside interference. They also shared similar legal protections, having been granted recognition by tribal governments and environmental agencies as authentic indigenous communities deserving of territorial and cultural rights. I realized that the Desert Wind people were part of a network of criminal organizations that had developed a systematic strategy for using false indigenous identity as legal. protection for their operations. By manipulating academic researchers into legitimizing their claims, they had created a protective framework that made investigation and prosecution extremely difficult. Law enforcement agencies are reluctant to investigate communities that have been documented as authentic indigenous groups by respected academics. Environmental and cultural protection laws provide additional barriers to surveillance and enforcement, and the legal complexity of indigenous sovereignty issues makes it nearly impossible for outside authorities to determine which communities are legitimate and which are elaborate criminal fronts. I'm sharing this account because I believe other researchers may have been manipulated in similar ways, and because the public should be aware of how indigenous identity is being exploited by criminal organizations to avoid law enforcement attention. But I'm also aware that by exposing this information, I may be putting myself at risk. The people I encountered claimed to be part of a network that extended throughout the Southwest and beyond. They demonstrated sophisticated planning capabilities and made it clear that they consider threats to their security to be serious matters requiring direct action. If anything happens to me, if I disappear or die under suspicious circumstances, the authorities should investigate the communities I studied during my 2022 research, particularly those that claim to maintain traditional indigenous practices in remote desert locations. The exploitation of indigenous identity for criminal purposes is not just a matter of cultural appropriation or academic fraud. It's a systematic strategy that undermines legitimate Native American communities while providing protection for dangerous criminal enterprises that operate throughout the American Southwest. Story 4. The support group. My name is Lisa Chen, and I survived what I thought was a support group for people dealing with trauma and addiction. What I discovered was something far more sinister than anything I could have imagined when I first walked into that community center in Portland, Oregon. In the spring of 2023, I was struggling with the aftermath of a car accident that had killed my husband and left me with chronic pain and severe depression. I'd been through conventional therapy, tried various medications, and attended several different support groups, but nothing seemed to help me process the grief and guilt that dominated every aspect of my life. My therapist, Dr. Patricia Williams, recommended a group called Survivor's Circle that she said had shown remarkable success in helping people recover from traumatic experiences. According to Dr. Williams, the group was led by a man named Michael Santos, who had developed innovative techniques for trauma recovery that went beyond traditional therapeutic approaches. Michael has a gift for helping people find meaning in their suffering, Dr. Williams told me. His methods are unconventional, but I've seen them produce results when nothing else has worked. Dr. Williams explained that Survivor's Circle was a closed group that met weekly in a community center in Southeast Portland. New members were accepted only after an interview process to ensure they were ready for the intensive emotional work the group required. I was desperate enough to try anything that might help me find a way forward, so I called the number Dr. Williams had given me and spoke with Michael Santos about joining the group. His voice was warm and compassionate, with the kind of authority that suggested extensive experience in dealing with people in crisis. "Lisa," he said, after I'd briefly described my situation, "I can hear the pain in your voice, and I want you to know that you've come to the right place. Survivor's Circle has helped hundreds of people transform their trauma into something meaningful and powerful." Michael explained that the group met every Tuesday evening from 7 to 9 p.m., and that the meetings combined traditional talk therapy with what he called experiential healing practices that helped members process trauma on deeper levels than verbal discussion alone could reach. "We don't just talk about our pain," Michael said. "We work together to understand the larger purpose that our suffering serves, and we help each other find ways to transform that suffering into strength and wisdom." I was intrigued by the idea of finding purpose in trauma, and Michael's approach sounded like it might offer something different from the conventional therapy that had failed to help me. I agreed to attend an intake interview the following week. The intake interview took place at the community center where Survivors Circle held its regular meetings. The building was a converted warehouse in an industrial area of southeast Portland, the kind of space that nonprofit organizations often used because the rent was affordable and the layout could be configured for various purposes. Michael Santos met me in the lobby and immediately impressed me with his presence and professionalism. He was probably in his mid-40s, with graying hair and the kind of calm, authoritative demeanor I associated with experienced therapists and counselors. He was dressed casually but expensively, and he spoke with confidence about his methods and the success he'd achieved with previous group members. Lisa, before we begin, I want you to understand what Survivors Circle offers that you won't find in traditional therapy, Michael said, as he led me to a small office space. Most therapeutic approaches focus on helping you cope with trauma or move past it. We focus on helping you understand that your trauma happened for a reason and that your suffering can become a source of power and transformation. Michael's office was decorated with what appeared to be artifacts from various spiritual traditions: crystals, incense burners, symbolic artwork, and shelves of books on topics ranging from psychology to mysticism to alternative healing practices. It looked like the workspace of someone who drew inspiration from multiple sources but wasn't committed to any single therapeutic philosophy. During the intake interview, Michael asked detailed questions about my accident, my husband's death, my current emotional state, and my previous attempts at therapy and recovery. But he also asked questions that seemed less directly related to my trauma, about my spiritual beliefs, my family relationships, my financial situation, and my living arrangements. I ask about these areas because healing happens in the context of your entire life, Michael explained. We need to understand all the factors that influence your recovery process, including practical matters that might affect your ability to commit fully to the group's work. Michael's questions about my financial situation were particularly detailed. He wanted to know about my insurance coverage, my income sources, my savings and assets, and whether I had family members who might be able to provide financial support if needed. The work we do in Survivor Circle is intensive, he said. Some members find that their healing process requires them to make significant changes in their lives, changing jobs, ending unhealthy relationships, sometimes even relocating to environments that better support their recovery. I want to make sure you have the resources to pursue whatever path your healing requires. At the time, these questions seemed reasonable. I was obviously in crisis, and a responsible therapist would want to understand my overall situation before recommending a treatment approach. I answered his questions honestly, explaining that I had received a substantial insurance settlement from the accident, and that I was currently unemployed but financially stable. After the interview, Michael told me that he thought I would be an excellent fit for Survivors Circle and invited me to attend the next weekly meeting. He also gave me a packet of reading materials to prepare me for the group's approach. These materials will help you understand our philosophy and methods, he said. We believe that trauma is not just something that happens to you randomly. It's part of a larger pattern of experiences that are designed to teach you important lessons about yourself and your purpose in life. The reading materials contained essays and excerpts from books about various alternative healing philosophies, spiritual transformation practices, and theories about the meaningful nature of suffering. Much of the content was derived from New Age spiritual movements, but it was presented in language that sounded more psychological than religious. The central theme was that traumatic experiences were opportunities for spiritual growth and that people who had suffered significantly were actually chosen for special purposes that required them to develop extraordinary strength and wisdom. The materials suggested that by embracing their trauma and understanding its deeper meaning, individuals could transform themselves into more evolved and powerful beings. I found these ideas both appealing and troubling. The notion that my husband's death and my subsequent suffering might serve some larger purpose was comforting in some ways, but it also felt like a form of spiritual bypassing that might prevent me from processing my grief in healthy ways. Nevertheless, I was curious about the group and desperate enough to try approaches that I might have dismissed under normal circumstances. I decided to attend at least one meeting to see what Survivor's Circle was really about. The first meeting I attended included 12 other group members, most of whom appeared to be dealing with various forms of trauma, addiction, or major life crises. The group was roughly evenly divided between men and women, with ages ranging from the early 20s to late 50s. Michael opened the meeting by leading the group in what he called a centering practice, a brief meditation that was designed to help everyone transition from their daily concerns to the focused work of the group session. The practice involved controlled breathing, visualization exercises, and the repetition of affirmations about personal power and transformation. Tonight we gather as survivors who are choosing to become warriors, Michael said as he concluded the centering practice. Each of us has been marked by experiences that would destroy weaker individuals. But we are here because we recognize that our suffering has prepared us for something greater. The group members responded to this opening with obvious enthusiasm, nodding agreement and murmuring words of support. It was clear that they had embraced Michael's philosophy and saw themselves as special individuals who had been chosen for extraordinary purposes. The meeting format combined elements of traditional group therapy with practices that seemed derived from various spiritual and self-help movements. Members shared their experiences, but the focus was not on processing emotions or developing coping strategies. Instead, the emphasis was on identifying the lessons and purposes that their trauma was meant to teach them. Sarah, tell us what insights you've gained this week about the deeper meaning of your experiences. Michael said to a woman who appeared to be in her 30s and was dealing with childhood sexual abuse, "I'm beginning to understand that my abuse wasn't just something terrible that happened to me," Sarah replied. "It was preparing me to help other survivors find their strength. The pain I experienced gave me the sensitivity and wisdom I need to guide others through their own transformation." Other group members responded with applause and verbal encouragement. Michael praised Sarah for her insight and asked her to share more about how she planned to use her experiences to help others. As the meeting continued, I began to notice patterns in how members discussed their trauma. Instead of focusing on recovery or healing, they talked about their suffering as if it were a qualification or a credential that gave them special status and abilities. They seemed to compete with each other about who had endured more severe experiences, as if trauma were a measure of spiritual advancement. Most concerning was the way Michael encouraged this dynamic. He praised members who described their trauma in the most extreme terms and suggested that people who had suffered more were closer to achieving the transformation the group promised. "The depth of your pain determines the height of your potential," Michael told the group. "Those who have suffered most intensely have the greatest capacity for transcendence." By the end of the meeting, I felt a huge thank you to everyone who stayed with me until the very end. Your presence makes this journey into the unknown feel a little less lonely, and I'm really grateful you chose to spend your evening here. I hope these stories gave you exactly what you were looking for, the perfect mix of fear and fascination. There is something special about how we can all come together in the darkness, united by our love for a good scare. I truly hope tonight's tales hit you just as hard as they did me. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like it and subscribe to the channel for more creepy content. Your support helps me keep bringing these stories to life. And I'd love for you to be back tomorrow night when I share more mysteries and chills. Until then, sleep tight, dream sweetly, and don't let tonight's stories creep into your dreams. But if they do, just remember, they're only stories. Sweet dreams, my friend. See you tomorrow night.